Hello everyone and welcome to the first Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. My name is John Davis. I'm a director at RSK Biocensus and I head up the RSK Wilding team, which focuses on biodiversity net gain. And today we're going to be talking about ecological restoration. And given that this is the United Nations decade of ecological restoration and we're halfway through it, it's probably not a moment too soon. Anyway, before I introduce you to the speaker, if you can go on to the next slide, Tim. Oh, I've just given a game away on your name. Right, so the housekeeping as usual. So your microphones are off, everyone, but you can still ask questions if you pop them into the Q&A box on your panel. There'll also be a feedback form coming to you about an hour or so after the talk is over. And do fill in that form and give us any ideas for future talks. That would be brilliant. So let's introduce our speaker. If you come to the next slide, Tim. So Tim Graham is has in a previous life, or several previous lives, was CEO of a number of wildlife trusts. I won't name them because there are too many to mention. But he was also at the Office of Environmental Protection before I snaffled him up into Wilding a couple of years ago. He's been absolutely instrumental in our success as a responsible body. So that's regulating habitat banks for B&G, which has gone very well. And he also leads for us on green finance and voluntary biodiversity markets. And most relevant to this talk, he is a co-convener for CIEEM's Ecological Restoration Special Interest Group. So he is the perfect person to talk us through ecological restoration. And I think I will hand straight over to you, Tim, if that's okay, if you want to turn your camera off, and I will do the same. Over to you.
Thank you, John. And I will move on to the agenda. So, yes, great to be invited to speak on something that I've been involved in for so long. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to set the scene. So obviously kind of cover the why of ecological restoration as a bit of a sort of quick canter through the what ecological restoration is. It's got to be slightly quick considering the technicality, but it should give you a great flavour no matter what sort of level of knowledge you've got on the subject. I'll then sort of highlight and bring in how we're involved with the CIEEM special interest groups and guidance development, obviously having set the scene for why that's important, and finish up on a couple of quick sort of live examples for how they're fitting in really. So okay, first section, the what and the why. I'm not going to focus on negative graphs, so I've put hopefully the kind of positive future sort of graphs really. Many people, any ecologists on, will be used to the sort of graphs of decline, etc. Suffice to say, we should all be familiar with what's now the sort of agreed international vision. It's moved from something that was more sort of focused around protection and slowing the loss kind of perspectives, moving to no net loss, but now it's very much more something that's more proactive. In some ways, I hope it's a simpler message in some ways as well, moving to that nature positive world. So that's about putting nature back on a path to recovery. You often hear the phrase bending the curve, and that this is exactly why. You can see that curve moving back up to the positive. So we know the changes that are needed to sort of shift this global crisis, and restoration becomes front and center, which is something you can see in the chart on the right. That kind of green area, hopefully, that's showing is the sort of restoration bit, and moving into the climate sort of blue part where this really fits in as the foundation, hopefully. Now, that said, we've also got to face, I suppose, the current reality, for want of a better phrase. It's not something really particularly new. Luckily, there's no shortage of sort of current and older evidence about how important nature is. And in particular, it's good to remember that a sort of government pushed and funded review really does emphasize how critical nature is to our continued prosperity, and specifically mentions restoration and its place in continued prosperity as well. And next to that, there's obviously a direct link from our natural assets and their kind of state, what kind of risks that actually presents to the economy. So in a way, we're kind of seeing the language show how closely linked these kind of components are. And some people like the language, some people don't, but it's clearly becoming more and more a mainstay of the communication about economics. Whether it's fully taken on board, it's different, but the risk is clearly being presented now. So there's some good facts in terms of material risks from the degradation of the environment and how much that could impact GDP. With the Green Finance Institute's report sort of highlighting that it could be between 6 and 12%. So, these aren't small things, basically. So that direct link from nature to economic risks helps put restoration strongly on the agenda. There's no avoiding it. But as well as risks come large value, in effect. So the global added value of 8 trillion from nature positive action, you kind of can't miss that in effect. And also thinking about where this starts fitting in and putting restoration in a bit more of a markets kind of element and discussion. This growing interest in how sort of nature-based solutions, investment in voluntary biodiversity credits, etc., can really help push recovery. It's valued around 78 billion globally. So we're not sort of talking small numbers in any way, and where all this starts fitting together. And it's increasingly becoming part of the government approach as well. So we know in the UK that there's a funding gap in terms of what we need to invest to achieve nature recovery. So it's not a small number in terms of between 44 and 97 billion up to 2030. And basically that means that the government's looking to put its green finance strategy front and center, and private investments very much part of the solution. And increasingly, we basically see that coming out. So anybody who's seen this recently, anybody based in the North may have even been there at its launch, but some of the sister companies, so Nature Positive and Binny's, were involved in aspects of this in the past, and it sets a real sort of investment plan for investing in nature in the North via Nature North. So you can easily see that online at the moment. So what's this all mean, and kind of where's that all coming to in terms of action? Many people will be familiar with this. It's moving very much from the global down to the national scale, and there's a whole regiment of where this fits in. But ultimately, private investment restoration front and center within the goals and targets of the global biodiversity framework agreed at Montreal. Obviously, John's already mentioned we're nearly halfway through the UN Decade for Ecological Restoration, which was proposed and kind of put forward because of how important restoration is looking to the future. Those of you looking a little bit further abroad or working in Ireland, etc., and across Europe will be familiar with the EU restoration law that was passed. And so, it's starting to take a legal front, and something that we saw earlier, just the other week actually, is the UK having a national biodiversity strategy and action plan now, setting out our delivery to 2030. The reason why I'm going to quickly skip in is basically England's had legal targets because of the Environment Act 2021. It's got a legally based, statutorily underpinned delivery plan in effect through the Environmental Improvement Plan. So we're seeing this move to sort of statutory targets for delivery and things that are involving restoration front and center, and increasingly the other nations are having these discussions. So there's already talk and consultation around statutory targets that are going to be relevant for Scotland and Wales basically as well. Now, next to that, we've got the kind of mechanisms that have to support the implementation and things. And many of these things, you'll know that these are a little bit more in different states of sort of delivery and things. So we've got the environmental land management schemes, we've got these nature gain systems, so biodiversity net gain being very much in the forefront here, but also we've got net benefits in Wales, and we've got the kind of delivery of positive states for biodiversity in Scotland. We've got the building of nature networks, so local nature recovery strategies in England. We've got nature recovery plans, and we've got sort of nature networks in Scotland and things that are all becoming relevant, planned at local to national levels. And obviously on the other side, we've got the kind of corporate requirements, TNFDs, disclosures and things that are coming in that are really starting to sort of cement a level of impact around supply chains and some of these much wider risks to business and things that are really starting to be talked at a board level. And just to re-emphasize, next to all of this is this kind of commitment from government to green finance and sort of moving towards £1 billion of investment annually towards the end of the decade. So there's a lot to be done and delivered, and restoration becomes front and center for part of this. So what is ecological restoration? Where does it fit in? It comes sort of from an international kind of perspective in many ways, developed heavily over in North America and things, and linked to kind of approaches to conservation and large scales over there. But interestingly, we're getting to the point where principles and standards are very much at the forefront because of how much is being done. We've done elements of this for a long time, but actually really getting to grips with what's needed and understanding different situations, what state nature's in different locations, and sort of how degraded, etc., and how much restoration is possible, perhaps. This is starting to really get detailed. So its origins are quite diverse. I'm not trying to say this is brand new. Certainly in more detail, you can kind of follow it as conservation biology and things developed from the early 90s and things. And there's a heavy sort of emphasis and sort of view from the United States as well as Australia that has sort of coloured a lot of where ecological restorations come from, really. And Europe and the UK have a really strong presence within that, but it's slightly different. So what actually is ecological restoration? So it's about the process we deploy to ensure recovery. So it's the process assisting the recovery and the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So it's about how we're ensuring recovery where there's been these negative impacts. So I'll throw up some actually sort of more formal definitions on the right as we move through this. Importantly, it's about the process and how we're actually delivering that outcome of recovery. So the international standards sort of separate the two things. So restoration being the activity we undertake, and recovery is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, in effect. And one of the big things that has shifted over the years is about understanding this continuum of actions from what's really heavily sort of moving towards fully wild and restored states that may only be possible in certain places, to the sort of more impact and pressure reducing on the opposite end of the scale. So there's this restoration continuum that gets talked about, starting with something that's much more common to kind of be able to be involved in, to much more specific ecological restoration within these restorative actions that's over on the right, about initiating real recovery. So it's keeping kind of repair and improving and getting things better slightly separate, but there's a lot of actions that can contribute to ecological restoration. So the other side of that is about the fact that not every sort of set of actions or ambitions for an initiative might be aiming for full sort of gambit ecological restoration. We want to see huge tracts of ecosystem processes and wilded land somewhere. A lot of different kinds of actions can be restorative, and importantly, it's recognized that it's all part of the solution, especially considering this much wider nature and climate crisis. So kind of bringing it a little bit together with the points before, obviously the more restoration, the more we repair and allowing our natural assets to recover, the more we're generating and reaping all these benefits, economic, health and well-being. Lots of this, I'm not going to go into the nth detail about, there's a lot of sort of information and evidence out there that's just going to keep increasing and hopefully see more in practice. So the key thing with lots of sort of restoration going on and the ambition coming out front and center more commonly now is the fact that there's more conversations about, well, what do we know, what do we need to know, and obviously what does good look like. So standards start getting talked about a lot more, and this is where our work with CIEEM come in, and it fits very much with what we've just been talking about in terms of ecological restoration. As this has grown and sort of entered our sort of lexicon of delivery within nature conservation, we've got this growing expertise. We've certainly got a lot of interest across the environmental sector, and that's just been growing. So lots of things previously, and maybe still are, heavily sort of leaning towards habitat creation and things, depending on the level of ambition. But this is all part and part of that continuum. Obviously, this is increasingly part of what I'd call standard practice in nature conservation and ecology. Certainly, restoration gets mentioned a lot. It's been part of what's been looked at for sort of minerals planning and things for a long time. And there's great examples out there already. But there's always this sort of emphasis about how do we increase the scale and pace of delivery. And with what's going on now, obviously that's becoming increasingly significant. If we're not defining what good looks like, what the best evidence is, where the evidence gaps are, it becomes harder to maintain our standards. So there's increasing ambition to achieve these sort of wilder states and getting more ecological processes and dynamics into schemes. Reintroduction is obviously hot on the agenda, especially after the recent news about beavers, and increasingly that's to all kinds of species and understanding the achievability. Obviously, I've already mentioned about biodiversity net gain. The scale and pace of where this is moving puts an emphasis on the state of knowledge and how we're sharing that, how we're learning lessons and things as well. So there's this real imperative need for sharing learning, knowing what good looks like, and obviously, again, this sharing of standards. So CIEEM and the special interest group and what we're working on there becomes really important. Now, in effect, this isn't sort of brand new as a special interest group, and there's a lot of other CIEEM. So that's the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management as a professional institute for ecologists. There's a lot of other special interest groups. This one started in 2019 because of the growing interest in habitat creation and ecological restoration. And importantly, I'm going to give a shout out to James Hicks, who may or may not be in the background as the audience as well. So he's on the committee, but importantly, he's the editor for the guidance that's on the right, and I'll mention in more detail on the next slide. I'm co-convener because of my interest, and it's very much of the interest for RSK Wilding and where we're involved in practice as a business unit within RSK Biocensus. So the other thing to make sure we mention is we're actually affiliated to the Society for Ecological Restoration Europe chapter. So we're trying to fit in with this international setup that CIEEM is very much interested in, and we were set up to help solve evidence and knowledge flow gaps and develop relevant competencies to feed in upwards to the internal CIEEM processes, and importantly to develop good practice guidance. So with BNG really kicking in, as well as all this wider interest, wilder carbon, woodland carbon code, where all these restoration sort of endeavors are sort of fitting together and increasing in scale, is about the fact that we want guidance to keep up, basically. So rebuilding nature, good practice guidance was set up in effect. There was other discussions beforehand, but work began more in earnest in 2023 via the SIG working group, and the special interest group basically put forward the actual idea and the definition, the need for guidance before we kind of got started. Now we're at a point where there's sort of 50 or more volunteers contributing across a range of topics, And the idea is to be a bit more sort of dynamic in terms of having this published online rather than paper, help with updating, and also the conversations about developing training at the same time. It's not going to be perfect, but it's certainly developing the training linked to the guidance much earlier on. Now, the principles were published in Jan 2024. They're available online, picture of the cover on the right. And the overarching topics are waiting in design, and they're going to be released sometime spring 2025. So watch this space for official publication dates. Now, these are the overarching topics that kind of can fit in across any sort of ecosystem or habitat, really. So project planning, physical environment, monitoring. What I'll mention in a minute in a little bit more detail is about the large scale nature recovery and restoration, and obviously this wider interest in the benefits and ecosystem services. So there's videos online from the CIEEM events that help sort of describe in a bit more detail what we'll be covering. They're online from January, basically. And then the key kind of detail parts, these are kind of grouped around some of the main broad habitats and things from the UK HAB as a sort of structural guide almost. And they're going to be published in groups from the summer 2025. So things like grasslands will be kept together, and a lot of common sort of states of evidence, etc., that make that very logical way to approach this. So watch this space for more information. So I said I'd mention large scale before getting to a couple of good examples. So why is going large scale important, and what kind of key elements might be mentioned about our approach to it? Basically, I'll have to be quite quick. There's obviously a lot more in the guidance than I'll cover now, but I've picked a couple of key elements to really sort of explore. So why does large matter? Well, this is front and center for what some of the things that we look at day in, day out at RSK Wilding. We're interested in the bigger and more complex. So it's very much part of our bread and butter in exploring this. So importantly, it's key to kind of reflect on the pressures and threats. So some of these things will only be tackled at large scale in this kind of much larger collaborative and strategic sense. So that's always part of it. Most people will be familiar with that, working in the environment. Increasingly, we've got this sort of ambition for scale and pace. You can see that through the sort of scale of delivery in Scotland and places, thinking Cairngorms Connect and stuff, as well as sort of landscape recovery schemes in England. So that's really important. And it's been evolving for some time because of impacts of fragmentation and degradation of habitats. The fact that we're increasingly putting it in as nature-based solutions, so they're able to tackle climate adaptation and amelioration. This sort of homogenation of the environment as we modify it, and the desire to remove or reverse that. Obviously, there's greater talking about wild estates and what kind of processes can be restored, as well as this ecosystem services, the benefits, and making sure they're flowing and society's is actually receiving them. So, water quality, and quantity and things often front and center. So I mentioned earlier, it's part of international national obligations and even now statutory. And so we're seeing there's sort of the volume of habitats, habitat targets need to be met, as well as if we're going to meet carbon targets, etc., land use and restoration is going to be part of that conversation as well. So interestingly, you can also see the need to kind of move beyond the sort of silo first, being very terrestrial ecology or very freshwater, and it being more of a conversation, especially once you move to a large scale, that delivery has to think in a much wider sense, basically, that these things are linked, that they're perhaps more separate and siloed because of how institutions work, funding works, or indeed how modified it is. So we need to look at a more expansive approach, and that goes from the sort of ambitions and details of the sort of ecology of an initiative, all the way through to how governance works. How do we collaborate and engage more with dialogue with communities and things as well? So a little bit on the approach. So obviously the guidance tries to define what is large, and I'm deliberately going to avoid that now. I'm not going to sit on the fence, but there's a lot about context. We've called it large scale rather than landscape scale because of the need to change that rhetoric about landscape, seascape, and actually it's much broader, but also about the fact that it can be about perspectives on time, of institutional scales, and also about what's relevant ecologically. So, you know, are we talking about the need for populations of springtails versus ospreys? Very different large scale requirements and differences in scale. So it's taking a slightly different approach to what needs to be thought about. Importantly, it's about thinking at a different scale, not just a single site that helps really define it. And it's about enabling the driving natural processes dynamics, and something that's increasingly sort of put in as a sort of goal is about complexity, because usually with that is greater sort of abundances, greater niches and greater resilience. Now, there's no getting away from something that's quite often missed out of the conversation. If it's restoration at a large scale, it's going to interact much more with the obligations and ambitions of nature recovery specifically, and I'll need a greater kind of understanding of what the drivers of decline and degradation are. Otherwise, it's on a hiding to nothing really, but also being able to actually implement the right restoration becomes key. One of the phrases that always gets mentioned is adaptive management, and so next to that, because I'll mention that just briefly on the next slide, are also the other approaches is about building resilience. I'll mention that quickly in another slide. Preparing for inevitable change. Change is all part of it. That's quite difficult in a very prescriptive sort of system, but we need to be better at it. Incorporating the wider benefits from ecosystems, how we do and don't do that. When does it drive it? When doesn't it? When is it just about communicating about the benefits, etc.? Not acting in a silo. Increasingly collaboration, how that fits, what suits that, what governance, and also this overall move away from prescriptive approaches, which can be difficult. Just outcomes, how do we meld those together? There's a lot to learn. Now, this is a bit shocking. Sorry for everybody whose sort of eyes hurt now, but just to highlight, there's a fair amount in adaptive management. Importantly, it's that cycle of plan, do, learn. So here we've highlighted a little bit more detail relevance to large scale, but don't worry about all the wording, but moving from diagnosis all the way through implementation and evaluation, and then adjusting. And we talk about it a lot, and we're really going to have to get better about examining how effective we are in adaptive management, especially when you think about 30-year sort of agreements and delivery for biodiversity net gain in England. Then the last thing that I wanted to quickly highlight was just about resilience thinking. Resilience gets mentioned a lot. It's about the ability of an ecosystem to resist the impacts that are thrown at it. This, I suppose, a bit more my wording, and how it returns back to its normal. So what actually improves or reinforces this? I'm going to sort of split it out in terms of resistance and resilience. So resistance, and linking perfectly with some of the Lawton principles, this is a bit more about better and bigger. So a bit more of what you can do in terms of obligations on a site, in terms of management and expanding that. They basically improve condition and probably species conservation status more immediately at a granular level, and it helps ensure robust populations. On the resilience side, we're thinking a little bit bigger. So I've linked that in a greater sort of amount to the more enjoined part of the Lawton principles, and those actions are sort of larger scale processes and really help this kind of population dynamics, and importantly, range shifts, thinking climate adaptation, etc. So populations are much more robust through time in terms of that sort of side of actions, and trying to understand what that looks like, what will work, etc., and what the ecosystem sort of constituents are really going to require is all part of how we would sort of think about this, design it. And there are a suite of tools in terms of looking at this. So sensitivity across scales, putting those two things together. A great example is the that I'd quite like, at least, is the England seabird strategy. But there's other approaches: systematic conservation planning, being much more specific about the incorporation of change and complexity, and then also this integration across systems, understanding how that's going to kind of work and where the sort of trade-offs might be. So very quickly, just two swift examples in practice. Obviously, something close to my heart in terms of the RSK Biosensors Responsible Body and Conservation Covenants. It could really have an interesting place in this larger scale. So it's all about how obligations are bound to particular parcels of land, but interestingly could be how the flexibility and kind of contract law involved in conservation covenants could really allow us to sort of adapt in multiple scales, from the individual land parcel to multiple land parcels with sort of collective agreements and individual covenants, etc., that might suit landscape recovery type schemes, as well as how this fits in with cooperative law and cooperative agreements, and how people receive benefits, thinking about natural capital and things as well. And the assurance is about binding to land. So really interesting point at the moment in terms of conservation covenants. And obviously in terms of resistance, they've got a place, from linked to the last slide, because some of the obligations that you can enforce will really help things be better and better managed. And on the other side, you can really help start to support greater population dynamics and range shifts. So coordinating what those obligations look like at a landscape level, or even greater coordination and cooperation with sort of hierarchy of agreements, so that they all agree to meet the requirements of a landscape, and then you've got an individual landowner agreement below it. So there's a lot that could be done there. So fitting in with restoration standards going to be really important, and increasingly nature finance, not just biodiversity net gain. It's about what the nature finance flows can be supported in terms of conservation covenants. And very quickly, sorry again for the diagram, I didn't have another way of explaining this, but actually there's a group of RSK Group companies that are very much front and center in different elements of this. So Binnies, ADAS, as well as ourselves and Nature Positive. And in effect, together, there's a potential to help solve this at a much larger scale compared to conservation covenants, which is about where business risk and restoration of the environment actually helps solve those problems, fits in with the strategies and the disclosures of companies. And then when you imagine it fitting well with the kind of nature finance and capital flows, the restoration projects then are really starting to benefit and scale up at a much more international relevant scale. And when you think about what supply chains might need, it's going to be a lot of different sort of corporate entities needing to invest, and they're increasingly looking at this in terms of their future exposure to risk. So that's a really interesting one. That's a live conversation at a different scale to conservation covenants. And then I think it's time for questions. So thank you. Back over to John.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Do you want to stick your camera back on?
Hopefully that's on now.
It's kind of amazing. So I did a master's in conservation about 30 years ago, and it was kind of more focused on, the small, not on small scale necessarily, but it's just how the problem has ballooned over the last 30 years, and now we're just having to deal with this at massive scale. And it's that change, I think, is quite interesting to see. So it's no longer, wildlife gardening, essentially. It's not just doing conservation on small scale. It's about having to take large areas of land, do that properly. And on the subject of doing it properly, you talk quite a lot about standards, what good looks like, also about all of this money that's being invested across the world in ecological restoration. So this is really taking off. So I wonder if you're concerned about greenwashing, because people are obviously going to be accessing money for restoration from all of these different areas. Are you worried that it won't be, delivered properly. There's that whole talk that you had about that whole section about conservation governance and what we're doing in this country, which is essentially regulating biodiversity net gain. Is there going to be something similar on an international scale? How can we be sure that there aren't going to be cowboys getting away with taking the money and not doing anything?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question. Obviously, most people in this space have reflected heavily because of what happened with carbon. So the need to remain high integrity. You can see where all of this fits in. There's sort of the BSBI flex standards that are out for consultation and things, so the nature market standards and things. The Scottish government are wanting to make sure that there's definition for ecological restoration, actually, because of the volume and the pace kind of going on there. So we're really seeing, I suppose, those assurance mechanisms sort of step in. Whether it's all kind of coordinated and things is a slightly different question, but certainly people are seeing that and wondering whether that's both a level that sort of slowing things down because it needs to maintain that assurance and high integrity, but also how much is that sort of slowing down the movement of capital? Is it going to help sort of remove the logjam almost and things? So it's constant bit of work in the background, and it'll be really important for us to face up to those things, what we don't know, and make sure that we're being quite transparent. So yeah, the greenwashing's potentially a significant issue because obviously it's hard to get away from the sheer sort of the largesse of the claims at the moment, and whether it's going to sort of provide the solution. So we've got to live up to that.
Okay, on a very sort of recent kind of news angle, a question about beavers. So this is from James Tan. Thank you for the question, James. From a restoration context, what do you think are the key costs and benefits people should take away from the UK beaver release? And how do you foresee it impacting the future?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so the costs and benefits, obviously, in a way. So one of the bits in the guidance, without sort of focusing on beavers particularly, was about focal species and the fact that some are engineers, some are the kind of almost pioneer and descriptor of ecosystems, etc., forming the structure. And so there's a really important element, in effect, the thought of as being able to do a level of the restoration. I suppose the question is how ready we are in all areas, perhaps. The other thing is, when we're thinking about sort of releases, translocations, reintroductions, is we've got a real commitment to their populations now. And so is planning and our other conservation efforts ready for that in a way? Once they're out there, what happens? What's the sort of enforcement checks? When can people control them? When do they need to be controlled? Is that ecologically sort of monitored and understood, or is it a bit more of a sort of political enterprise? And then once they're there, are they going to survive? Are they sort of in a climate bottleneck? I'm thinking a bit more to them as an example for other species. We've got to know that we're prepared and they're going to survive long term, in effect, once we put them out there. So there's some interesting questions for ecologists.
There are, and I think it is a really interesting question because it's all about doing this. If you're going to do it at scale, you want to do it cost effectively. And I think beavers just do it for you. They're ecosystem engineers, as people call them. You've got bison as well. We've got a project in Africa where we want to restore savanna at scale, and we're going to do it by using, the grazing of cattle. So there are ways, I think, to do massive scale restoration cost effectively without it being, a huge input of time and effort.
And we've got to look at it, I mentioned the scale and pace we need. And obviously we're nearly halfway through the decade of ecological restoration. We know we've got really difficult targets for 2030 and beyond to meet. So we need all of this in our armory, basically, and to kind of be able to understand what it's delivering where. And then we might not need to focus on that. We can focus on other areas because the beavers are doing their thing wherever they are. If there's places they're less successful, maybe that's an excuse to focus in different ways. understand whether they're needed there or it's something else. So yeah, definitely an excellent part of the picture.
Yeah, and really, really important to understand how you can use certain species to do this at scale and cost effectively. Okay, another question. It's moved. What would you say the most important skills are in being a project manager in conservation efforts? I guess that ties into your adaptive management, being flexible, not being too prescriptive, perhaps.
Yeah, and obviously there's kind of a level of where, so one thing has probably changed a lot since I began with my interest is the fact that project management and things is actually part of the lexicon and part of the skills needed now. As things get more complex and larger, more governance, sort of collaboration and that side of skills within project management are going to be needed, and that might be different people to kind of program managers depending, but I think that's really important. One, we know what happens sort of if communities aren't involved long term, but also if you've got quite a lot of sort of actors and organizations involved, that becomes quite complex. So those skills can be quite different, but being aware about that, as well as it could be quite onerous and nearly said hideous, various different blended funders, and then without that you might have legal agreements and kind of contractual stuff that people need to increasingly know at least what the obligations are and why, and they'll enter it. If we get that extra funding, we'll see all these added sort of requirements on the skills and expertise. At the moment, I think it's just really important to note that actually project management and ensuring large scale deliveries going on, that'll take quite different sort of skill sets depending on the scheme. You can imagine if it's involving water, flooded alleviation linked to wetland habitats, there's a lot of quite strict consents to make sure are being met. And then on the other side, it might be heavily about landowner liaison, understanding large grazing dynamics and things, and how to step away or when, perhaps, which could be interesting, knowing when to step in. So there's a lot.
Because you talk about, it's about the outcomes and obligations. It's the end point. It's recovery is what you're trying to get to. And don't be too prescriptive, be flexible, have the skill sets available to make sure you get to that point, which might be a variety of different skills because, events, my dear boy, events, things happen, you get wildfires, you get flooding, you get all sorts of stuff.
I think the other thing that'll change is just about that reflection on judgments from land managers and things, because it all impacts, if you've got that flow of sort of funding that everybody would like to see, then something's got to be delivered for it. And so the judgment and people like ourselves, ecologists and other land managers, having the confidence and understanding the justifications for the judgments might become increasingly important. And that might be a new way of sort of operating in practice really for us. Some people are, a bit more used to that, but perhaps it's a little less sort of front and center for nature conservation and things.
There are two more questions I'm going to ask since we're nearly out of time, and they're kind of related to what we've just been talking about. First is from Tanya White, who says, "Amazing Tim." I'm going to call you Amazing Tim from now on. Can I ask if you have insight into a land value change framework where there's a consistency of indices of change, albeit I agree prescriptive needs to be adaptive so long as outcomes aren't eroded in overall value. So that's kind of going back to what we were saying, I guess a flexible framework for the change in land.
Yeah, and in some ways you could imagine there might be a need, depending on the sort of level of ambition, there might be a few different ones almost, because you've kind of got the full whole hog trying to wild the hell out of something versus something that's a little bit more defined by surrounding land use perhaps, or water levels, or something that can't sort of be changed as easily without wider impacts. So one of the things I've always thought about when you're trying to institute dynamics, one, in restoration ecology, a lot of things are about trajectories, and that's similar with rewilding and then the language there. And so you've can probably define levels of acceptable change, and that would need to be updated and adapted. But you should be able to know what you're expecting and why, what's the sort of assumptions involved, and then it becomes, okay, what's the risk of not achieving something linked to this bigger, whatever the funding's kind of linked to. Hopefully that risk isn't out of the ordinary, in which case it probably shouldn't be moving that way to that funding. But then you can imagine there's a certain amount of change we don't know that's going to happen in terms of climate change and things, and we've got to collectively be able to adapt to that. So there's kind of a local initiative sort of level of change to understand and prescribe, report or examine, and then there's got to be this central learning in a way of what's acceptable. When things sort of get heavily legal, there's sort of, how would you define negligence versus what the environment's just trying to do, and it's unavoidable even with the best effort, and that's
Yes,
going to be interesting for us all to get to grips with, I think.
It does all link down to experience and expertise, and investing in ecologists who know what they're talking about, because you need to have that flex. And so that ties into the last question from John Holt, who says, John mentioned greenwashing and the risk of cowboys carrying out restoration work. How important do you think it is that experience, qualifications and accreditations for environmental contractors tasked with restoration work? And I'd say it's very important.
Yeah, so it's very important, and then there's this balance to get, because obviously in some of Wilding's projects, we've done this work for Natural England, CIEEM, looking at assurance, etc. And one of the key things is about who are you trying to raise the standards of? Because when you institute a system of accreditation, of training and certification, all of the kind of good players invest and have the money and are likely to take it up. And the people who you want to shift the standards of, the cowboys, aren't going to touch it and are just going to kind of try and circumvent. So it's actually very hard to target without really forcing everybody through a route, which can be costly. It takes time to build these things, but it's exactly the conversation of, you start with sort of the good practice, the transparency of why people are approaching things a particular way, and sort of start building in, getting the right professional competencies for an ecologist and other professional institutes, that the training is available and can, it's easy to demonstrate what and why. And then you could imagine it's trying not to sort of push out to the periphery or the dark, almost, the people that you actually want to draw in to raise the standards of. And we've got an issue, maybe, if you take B&G as an example, there's a lot of probably wider landscape companies jumping in, saying they can do restoration works. Some of it may be very similar to what they're already doing, but actually in some cases they might be going beyond kind of their competency, and that's hard one to judge. And if it's a good price, people are going to jump to it. And one of the questions is there a race to the bottom? So we've got to be quite strict in some ways.
But... Sorry, we're running out of time, so I'm going to. All I'd say to you, John, is that this is why we got in to be a responsible body, because this needs regulating. It needs people to check on what people are doing to make sure it's going in the right direction. And we're looking at doing that at scale internationally as well, and how we can take our learning from conservation covenants and that kind of role that we have of checking people's habitat management and monitoring plans, making sure what they're saying they're going to do is going to work. That needs to be rolled out on an international scale to make sure you don't have cowboys doing this across the world, and that you don't end up with the same situation we had with carbon, for example. Anyway, look, there are quite a few other questions. Tim has agreed to follow those up afterwards. I'm telling you that, Tim.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah, you knew that was coming. So apologies if we haven't got to your questions, but we are out of time. So Tim will email responses to those. Just a reminder that you will be getting a feedback form in about an hour's time. Also to say that the next month, so April's First Thursday Club, will be given by Chris Catherine, who heads up Caledonian Conservation, who recently joined RSK Biocensus, which I'm very happy about. And Chris is an entomologist, which I'm also very happy about, since that's what I do. And his talk is entitled Consideration of Terrestrial Invertebrates in Ecology Projects. So a very important subject dear to my heart. So I think that's probably it from us. Thanks very much for tuning in. Tim, thanks so much for that. That's fantastic. And hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.